What's going on, guys? Welcome to the David F. Haas podcast. In the studio solo today, we're supposed to have a guest, and he had to cancel. So, I was doing some guidance this morning. I said, "What should I talk about on today's podcast?" Because as a podcast host, finding topics and stuff is something that you have to do. And so, because of my technique and what I do is I just basically ask in guidance, and this is what this podcast is going to be about. It's the title of it is going to be "The Way to God." If you have a problem with the word God, which if you listen to this podcast, you shouldn't, but you can insert your own belief in some sort of higher power. If you don't believe in something higher than yourself, then that would be a good question to ask yourself: is what is it that you believe in that's higher than you? And so in that guidance, the guidance that came to me was I should talk about my relationship with God. And I was like, okay, well, that'll be a good podcast. I said, well, what should I talk about? And then it's just like, talk about how I got reconnected to the power of God. And just so you know, as a caveat moving forward, my relationship or my belief in God is not so much as like a hymn, even though you may hear me say hymn, and that's just probably like as a programming from my childhood, because I kind of grew up religious, in a religious, not overly religious upbringing, but my mom was a minister, so I spent a lot of time in church, essentially. But anyways, now my view of like this one being kind of like at the power of everything is probably shifted, and it's more so my belief in God is the all-knowing, all-present, all-powerful energy that connects each and every one of us. And so you could kind of almost even see that as like empty space. So recognizing that even in this room that I sit in right now, there's empty space, and that empty space connects me and Zach that are sitting in the same room. But if you do an expansion of that empty space, that empty space connects every single person on earth. And so if you view the energy of God as the energy in the empty space that connects each and every one of us, you'll recognize that empty space is everywhere. It's everywhere at all times. It sees everything. It's all present. It's all powerful, and it's all knowing. And so that's kind of the energy that I connect to when I say the word God. And so some people use universe, some people use source power, some people use infinite intelligence. Whatever your word is, you can just put it in there every time you hear me say the word God. But for me, I use God. And so why is it important for you to listen to this podcast? Because I think it's good to get some perspective on what can actually happen when you learn how to get connected to that all-knowing, all-powerful, all-present energy that does exist for each and every one of us to tap into it. Because if you have like a pressing problem in your life, or a problem that keeps showing up and you can't get the answers to it, you have to learn how to get outside of your own mind and tap into that infinite power to resolve things. And so when you learn how to do that, the better you get at it, the quicker the answers come. And then eventually you move to this place of complete surrender, where you basically just have turned everything over to that higher power. And you just recognize that there is no reason for you, when I say you, I mean ego, self, mind, body, to solve any problem, because every problem has already been solved. And so I'm getting real deep really early here, but essentially, when you have God on your side, you're kind of like in a really good spot. And so, just to give you an example of what I'm going to teach you by the end of this podcast. So right now, at Lungo Vita, during the fall season, it's kind of like we have summer, and then we have all this money coming in because we're just booked up. And then September hits, and it kind of like shuts off, and it picks back up in October. But anyways, we're in like a little bit of let's call it a cash crunch. And so I was doing this with a client of mine who's also insanely connected. I'm hoping to do some more stuff with him in the future. And I said, hey, we're doing this technique that I call, I don't call it, it's called Conversations with God, where you basically just write out on a piece of paper. You would put a D for Dave, and you would write, what is it, what is the deal with this cash crunch? And then you put a G for God, and then you wait for God to respond. And so he's doing it for me, and I'm doing it for me. And the answer is that basically came to me is that God responded was like, what cash crunch? There is no cash crunch. The cash crunch is a belief that you created. There's cash all around. There's money all around. I have money from business partners. I have money in some investments. I have money in other assets. And the limitation was me actually kind of like going all in on Lungo Vita because I have this belief or this fear that it may not work out and I'm going to lose all my money. And it's just like, it's all fear-based, right? And so when I basically opened up my eyes out of that meditation, I'm like, got onto my investment portfolio. I cashed in that investment portfolio. Recently I listed my car for sale, and I'm like, I'm just gonna do everything that I need to do to make this thing work, because I truly believe and trust that God's got my back. And so, I've been, contemplating what I'm supposed to do for the last 3 months, because I knew this kind of cash crunch was coming. And then like in like a 5-minute session, and me and both my client kind of got the same answers, was like, there is no cash crunch. The cash crunch is a belief that you have created, and the lack of action is all out of fear. And I was like, oh my God, like this is the power that comes when we're connected. But the purpose of this podcast is, how did I get to that point where I believe actually what is being written down on the paper? When I sit in silence and I ask for guidance to come through, how have I gotten to the point where I'm basically trusting that this is a message from this higher power? And so that's what I'm going to walk you through today. And by the end of it, hopefully I'll give you some tools and techniques so you can get off this podcast and you can use some of them immediately to start getting some answers to your most pressing questions. And I guess so where it began was, like I said, my mom was a minister. She had a great relationship with God, and she passed away when I was 9 years old. And there's a lot going on there with respect to her passing away. And I recognized that part of her relationship with God was kind of, in some ways, a little bit fear-driven. And I think a lot of Christians and Catholics especially get wrapped up in religion and spirituality, and recognizing that they are two very different things. And so in the Catholic Church, a lot of what has been taught, and this is a recontextualization of what Jesus actually taught, is that we are all sinners and we have to repent our sins in order to go into heaven. And so it's all very like fear and guilt based. When you start getting deeper into this work, you and I think that's actually what removed me from religion at some point. When you get deeper into this work, you recognize that there is no need ever to be forgiven from God, because God never condemned us in the first place. God just sees us all as innocent and doing what we think is best to do at the time for our survival. And the only judgment that we will ever face is the judgment that we have for ourselves when we reflect back on our lives when we do pass over. And so there is no judgment at all from God, right? And so this idea in that religion preaches that the God is this evil, vengeful God. It's just not true, right? It's God is the all-knowing, all-loving, right? And it's like kind of the same way you look at your kids. It's like, yeah, your kid can do something wrong, but like you don't stop loving them, right? You just recognize they're a kid being a kid, and eventually they'll come to the awareness that they need to come to transcend that behavior. And so this is the way that God looks at us, right? And so I guess part of that guilt-based, fear-based kind of thing is what drove me away from God. And when I was a kid, I was going to Sunday school and I believed in God. It was a part of my regular kind of language. I prayed at night. I did all of that. But then when my mom died, it's like we basically never went to church again. But also there was an anger and resentment towards God for taking my mother away from me. And so that was kind of basically when I turned my back on this energy of God, or at that point of what I knew it was. And actually, it stayed with me probably all the way up until my early 30s, where I started recognizing how much disdain I actually had for God. I remember I had this business partner that used to like say a prayer before every meal. And I was like, why are you so like, what are you doing that for? Like, that's so stupid, essentially. And I was essentially looking down on him for doing that practice. But now it's like, wow, I'm like, that's actually was a pretty advanced thing to do, because if you're praying over your food, before every meal, you're eating from this place of like gratitude, and you're not thinking about, it doesn't even really matter what it is that you're eating at that time. It's like you're eating from this place of gratitude and thankfulness. And I think that's probably a really good thing to do. And so anyways, the reason I'm telling that story though, is because that's how much like how angry essentially I was at this idea of God. And I was essentially an atheist. I didn't believe that God exists. I thought people were stupid that believed in God. But then slowly, as I started doing this work, I started making a return to God. And now, because of the work that I was doing, I was able to step out of what religion had kind of taught me about God. And I started connecting to like what God was really all about, right? Which is that unconditional love. It's like the essential state of love is what God is, and probably even beyond that. And so I started, bringing God back into my language. I started saying the word God. I started being around more people. And once you kind of like lean into the idea that there might be something greater than you that exists, then you start being shown that, yes, it is. And so how did I go from essentially believing in God to atheist to now where I am, where it's like, I don't even believe in God. It's like, I know God, right? And the sense of knowing God is like this really great place to be, because you just recognize that you're going to be okay. No matter what happens, even if you die, you are going to be fine because you recognize there is no death. And so how did I get there? Well, it was through the work that I do, which is essentially the evolution of my spirituality. And so in recognizing that my mind and my ego had one function, which is to keep me safe and protect me. When I say me, I'm talking about the body, the physical body. And so the mind was developed essentially to make sure that the body exists and it continues to exist and survive. And so everything that the ego, every thought that the mind has is a function of protection, right? And if you don't believe me, just start listening to what the mind is telling you on a daily basis. And it's all about survival. It's all about not wanting to experience poverty, not wanting to experience rejection, not wanting to be fat, not wanting to be broke, whatever. It's like, it's all not wanting to be embarrassed, whatever it may be. It's all protection. And so when I recognized that all of those protections that my mind had created were the source of all of my suffering, I started to recognize that, there must be something greater than mind. And having the ability to begin to learn how to observe my mind, I then began to identify with that greater power. So in Observer, what we do is we just start listening to our thoughts. So our mind can't observe our mind. So what is it that's observing our mind? It's our consciousness, it's our soul, it's our essence. And that soul is connected to all. So the more you begin to move into this observer and observe what the mind is telling you, the more connected you are to God. And so from that place of observer, I began to heal from all of the ailments that the mind had created. And let me give you one example so I can explain this. So I was like a terrible people pleaser, right? And so I would just basically say yes to everybody, especially when I got around people that had wealth or stature or physical presence. I was just like this people pleaser. I just constantly wanted everybody to like me. And as I began to do this work and I got really deep on people pleasing, the recognition of my people-pleasing behaviors was that, one, I wanted everyone to like me. I never wanted to feel the pain of rejection. Two, I was avoiding confrontation at all costs. I did not want to get into confrontation. And if you get really deep, the true source of that avoidance of confrontation, it's multifaceted, but the true source of it was that when I was a kid, I got pinned under these welding tanks. When I was in my dad's garage, got pinned under these welding tanks, which I developed the fear of confined spaces. And so anytime I'd be like wrestling with my brother or my dad or whatever, and I would get pinned down, I would have essentially a panic attack and I would think I was going to die. That is what the mind perceived, that when I got pinned down, I was going to die, right? And so the mind began to develop programs to make sure that I never experience that fear ever again, right? Because it didn't want me to die. And one of the programs that it created was to be a people pleaser so that I never got into any physical altercation. Now I know that seems wild as I just kind of even lay it out for you here on the podcast. But when you get to like a really primitive level, which the ego is very primitive, you recognize that it comes down to like essentially survival of the fittest. And pretty much and Jordan Peterson talks a lot about this, in any male conversation, you are like one or two sentences away from it turning into a physical altercation. And so I developed this personality of people pleasing to avoid all physical confrontation. And Once I became aware of that, then I just went to work at solving the claustrophobia, right? And that's when I signed up for jiu-jitsu, and I started putting myself in these places of confined spaces where I had to breathe through the fear. And the recognition was that I was not going to die. And when I no longer feared confined spaces, then I was then able to step out of people pleasing. Now, it took some time, like, because people pleasing had been a pattern for so long that I would catch myself people pleasing after I had even done the work of letting go of my fear of confined spaces, right? And so this process is essentially like, once you kind of solve, then what you have to do is you have to continue to catch yourself and remove yourself from the habit, right? And so this moves into like the 4 levels of competence, which is like, you have unconscious incompetence, meaning you have no idea what the problem is, you have no idea how to fix it. So I did not even know I was a people pleaser, and I had no idea why, and I of course had no idea how to fix it. Then I moved into conscious incompetence. I was aware I was a people pleaser, but I didn't know why. Then I moved to conscious competence. I was aware I was a people pleaser, and I was aware that I was avoiding rejection, and I was avoiding getting into physical altercations. And then even when I moved to conscious competence. Even when I was in conscious competence, which was that stage, I would still get trapped in the habit of people pleasing. And then I would have the awareness to catch myself and say, you just people pleased again, right? And so the more awareness I brought, then eventually I stepped out of all people pleasing, and I could stop people pleasing in the moment when it showed up. And I'm still not at the last stage, which is unconscious incompetence, meaning people pleasing doesn't even really show up. It just gets immediately resolved, right? And so I'm still not there because I still have to watch people pleasing. I have to actively be an observer and be like noticing myself wanting to agree when I don't, right? And so I'm still in the process of stepping out of that habitual pattern that was in place since I was probably like 7 years old, right? And so it was when I was 7 years old. I'm 46 now. So it's like I have like this 10-to-1 rule where it takes 1 year for one conscious year for every 10 that you were unconscious to resolve an issue, right? And so I'm still in that undoing of people pleasing. Now, I would say I probably am 98% of the way there, but every now and then I do catch myself being a people pleaser, right? And so as I began, so why did I go on this big long tangent? It's because this was a mechanism of the mind. So as I began dropping all of these mechanisms of the mind, one of the things that happens is that the mind that was once so busy with protection, it began to become more silent. I began to be more in the present moment. The mind wasn't constantly occupied with making sure that I didn't face rejection. I didn't fear poverty. I wasn't obsessed with getting, which was, my desire. And there was more space. And from that space, I started just becoming happier and like just enjoying life more, getting reconnected to who I truly was. And what ended up happening was I started to experience the power of God in multiple ways. One of the ways was through like treatments. I would be doing spiritual healing treatments on people. This is my mentor, Andrew Facca, who kind of introduced me to all this work and the work of Dr. David Hawkins. We would bring complete strangers into our group sessions and we would do healing treatments on these people. And what does a healing treatment look like? They would come in, they would lay on the table. We would put our hands on them or over them. And we would just say to God, what's going on with this person? How can I help? Right. And with like pinpoint accuracy, we would pick up on ailments, problems, emotional issues that these people have been holding on to their entire lives. And multiple times, over the course of the hundreds of treatments I've been a part of, in the first 2 or 3 minutes, the people would just be like bawling on the table because they finally were in a space where they could release all of that pent up emotion that they've been holding on to their whole entire lives. And so the more I was exposed to complete strangers that I knew nothing about, and I was able to connect to them at beyond the physical body, and I was able to pick up on everything that was going on with them, I started like really truly believing like, holy cow, there is something so much more than this physical existence that we are kind of like, we know about. And as I did more and more of that, I trusted more and more in it. And to the point where when I started my coaching business, I said it would have been great if I could have pulled up the email, but I had this one guy when I first started my coaching business, and it was like a referral from a friend. And he's like, this guy referred me. I don't really know how you can help me, but like, this is what I'm kind of going through. And he kind of explained it. And I was still kind of new to coaching or whatever. And I said, hey, you know what? Let me just do a scan on you for free. And he had no idea what I was talking about. And basically what a scan is like, I can connect to any single person as long as they're willing. First thing I have to do when I step into like doing a intuitive scan for somebody is I have to ask permission. It's like, do I have permission to do this scan? I've only once received the answer of no, because at the level of connecting to someone at this level, it's like, there is no judgment. There is no fear. It's like completely like, it's like this completely from this place of love. So 99% of the time the answer is yes. And so I said to this guy, I said, let me just do a scan for you. He's like, what's a scan? I'm like, don't worry about it. I'm just going to do a scan. I'm going to record it. I'm going to send it to you. And so I was doing this out of a little bit of my own doubt. I didn't want to charge the guy for it or whatever, but also a sense of like, I could probably help this guy. So I recorded this 15-minute scan where I just kind of like connect to the guy and say like, these are the things that I noticed that are coming up. And one of the things that came up was a connection to father and heart issues, but it was like matters of the heart, meaning like there was a disconnect of love, whatever, but there was also physical issues going on in the heart. I can't remember the exact wording that I put in this scan because I was just recording it intuitively. Anyways, about 3 months later, 6 months later, he messages me and he sends me this email that he's like, you literally saved my life. He's like, and I don't want to take credit because it was not coming from me, it's coming from God. But it's like, if you wouldn't have done that scan, he experienced like a heart palpitation or something, which he had experienced many times in the past, but normally he would ignore it. Because I did the scan and I said matters of the heart, he decides to go to the doctor, and the doctor says, hey, if you wouldn't have came here, you probably would have had a heart attack in the next, little bit because he had some sort of blockage. I don't know the exact term, and I would have to pull up the email. But anyways, that was kind of like for me, it was confirmation from God saying, hey, like, yes, this is what you're supposed to be doing. You're supposed to be helping people in this manner, right? And so then I began to experience that over and over and over again. And it wasn't just in scans. Sometimes I'd be with a client as I began my coaching business, and they would be telling me about their problems. And I would be like, I don't even know what I'm supposed to say to this person in this moment because I could see their suffering. And then I would just essentially surrender it over to God and be like, God, hey, like, I'm here to help. Like, you better hit me with some knowledge. And then almost every single time, something would come out of my mouth so profound that would create a profound shift in that person in that moment. And that's when I started trusting that, hey, this power, this all-knowing, all-powerful, all-present energy of God is available to us at all times. And I can basically plug into it whenever I want to. Now, the wild thing is that even though I know this and I believe it, it's like I'm still reluctant to plugging in. And why am I so reluctant to plugging in? Because I'm still trapped in ego, right? The ego, the mind, it is constantly trying to talk so much because it wants to make us believe that we are it. When I say us, I'm talking about our soul. It is trying to make us believe that we are it. And so it will fight the removal from all of its thoughts of protection to the present moment where we are connected to all with everything that it's got. So, I'm in this cash crunch out there at Lingo Vita, and I'm like, how am I going to solve this thing? I'm coming up with all these ideas and this and this. And then finally today, I sit in a guidance session, and I have multiple techniques for guidance, which I'm going to explain in a minute. And basically it's revealed to me, it's like, there is no cash crunch. It's just a belief that you've created. And it's like, and it was also revealed to me that you're not trusting God, right? It's like, you're not trusting that you can put every dollar that you have into this business and it's going to work out. And so it's like, oh my God, it's like, I'm like trapped in ego. I'm trapped in fear, ego, protection. Don't put all your money in. It's not going to work out. You're not going to get the money back, whatever it is. Or if you do go broke, you're not going to be okay. It's all this, a belief of the mind to protect me from the pain of failing, let's just say, or the pain of being in poverty. And so once I just saw that with clarity, it was like, just made a decision. So it took me 2 months of the ego trying to solve this problem. And it was solved in 2 minutes when I connected to the power of God. And so the more I did this, the more I removed the protections of the mind. the more I became connected, and the more I moved to this place of actually knowing that there is something greater than this. And now I move into this space where like there is no death. There's no such thing as death. It's all just life. And yes, while there is physical death, there is no death of the energy of life, right? It's kind of like light. There's no opposite of light. And people would say the opposite of light is darkness. No, darkness is just the absence of light, right? So it's like the same thing is true with life. Like you can't kill life, if that makes sense. And so, yes, incarnations and all this, it's all part of the cycle of life. And so I'm seeing it as like such a bigger thing these days. And the more I lean into it, the more I lean into that, there is no death, and the fear of death continues to melt away, because at the end, at the root of all fears is the fear of death, right? It's like, if you feel rejected, it's really that. Why do we avoid rejection at all costs? Because if we're rejected or not accepted 100 years ago or 200 years ago, you weren't a part of the tribe. And if you weren't a part of the tribe, you would die, right? If you experience embarrassment, that's right. It's the same thing. It's about that rejection. If you experience poverty, it's because the fear of poverty is really the fear of you're not going to be able to eat. You're not going to have a roof over your head. You're going to die. Everything is related back to the fear of death. And so if you can transcend the fear of death, which, I would say I'm heading in that direction, I'm not there, but if you can transcend the fear of death, then what is there to worry about? There's nothing to worry about. And so this is ultimately surrender. And that is when you basically have just turned over your life to God. You say every morning, you say, God, what do you want me to do today? And you just do it, right? With no fear, right? If God says sit on a rock for 24 hours, that's what you do, even though you have bills to pay and all this, and you just trust that it's all going to work out, right? And so, yeah, it's like an advanced state of consciousness, and that's where I'm heading. But that's where true peace exists, right? And that's what we're all after. Peace, freedom, whatever that may be. And so what are the techniques that I use to connect to this power? Well, technique one is letting go. I got to let go of all of the pain that I'm holding on to so I can get rid of the programs that the mind created that are making a lot of noise in my mind. So as I face claustrophobia, face the fear of confined spaces, then my mind is no longer thinking about avoiding all of these confined spaces. So I basically create room. So letting go is part one. Step two is I continue to expose myself to that interconnectedness, right? And so I do that in group healings and in my group work. But you could also just do it on your own. You could just close your eyes and connect to any single person in your life and say, how can I help them? And just do what you're being called to do, right? And so that there, and then finally, I moved into like guidance, where I basically would silent the mind. I would get into this really silent zone, and I would ask that power of God, like questions, right? And so if you want to start small, you can start with stuff that's not that big of a deal and see what kind of answers are revealed to you. And then the third way is or the fourth way, I use Conversations with God, which is a book you can read. It's a great book, but essentially what I do is I put a little D next to my name, and I write my question, and then I put a little G next to God, and I wait for God's response. And if I get a response that doesn't make sense to me, like I was doing this with my client, and he has some physical pain, and so I said, how will he be healed from the physical pain? And the response that I got from God was, he already is healed, but he's not physically, right? But so sometimes the answers you get are too vague. So then I say, well, what does that mean, right? And then I get explanations, right? And so you can go through this process on your own. You play with it. You read the book Conversations with God. You get more inclined to it. And then eventually you get to a point where you have just seen enough of it that you believe it, right? And so it is kind of like, yeah, you can go in with just blind faith and believe, but for me, it was almost like a stacking up of proof that finally led me to this place of like knowing God, right? And that's where we want to get to. It's not like a question in your mind, right? Because if there's a question in your mind, when you experience heartache or hardship, you will begin questioning immediately, right? So it's like when I experience now, like I'm in like this situation out at Lungo Vita, it's like there is no questioning of God, right? I'm not saying, God, why did you do this to me? Right? It's just like, I'm going to be fine, right? And so, yeah, the mind went like squirrel, monkey mind to try and solve and protect me. But then it's like the recognition is no matter what happens, I will be fine, right? And so will everybody around me. And it's only the mechanism of the ego that creates suffering. And so I'll leave this quote from Hawkins. Hawkins says, the narcissistic core of the ego is a source of all suffering. And so the idea of enlightenment is to continue to transcend that narcissistic core of the ego, which is all focused on you, and begin to connect to who we really are through the process of letting go, observation, connection, and helping others. And if you do that, you too will know God. And it's a great place to be because it's a removal from all fear. That's basically it. If you like the podcast, if you got any value whatsoever, just hit that subscribe button. We'll see you again next Sunday.